contains enormous amount of information on human history, human culture, and human society, human wisdom. So when a language disappears, then those important, precious knowledge disappears. So linguistic diversity is the asset, one of the important assets of humanity that we need to sustain. And I think our university, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, is a really sort of a crucial institution where we can look at the issue of linguistic diversity is alive, actually. We have so many languages that are taught in regular programs of undergraduate and graduate level. And we believe that learning language is more than just learning the language skills. It's about learning the culture, society, politics, and economy of the society, and history, of course. So, given the diversity of languages among humanity, so how do we view the linguistic diversity of humanity? We use the notion of cultural relativism in anthropology. Remember that cultural relativism is the perspective for understanding cultural diversity of the humanity, right? So cultures are just different, not hierarchical. So no culture is superior to or inferior to other cultures. And cultures should be understood in their own contexts rather than evaluated using someone else's standards. Exactly the same can be applied to linguistic diversity, and hence the term linguistic relativity. At this point, I would like to remind you the use of glossary of your textbook, which is towards the end of the book. There is a nice glossary, and terms like linguistic relativity and, of course, cultural relativism are very concisely defined. So whenever you need clear definition of any of the terms learned in the course, please look up the glossary and you will find a very nice definition. Of course, you shouldn't end there. You should understand the term in different contexts with different examples, but there are clear definitions of these important terms. Linguistic relativity means there are so many different languages, and languages are just different. There is no superior or more elaborate, sophisticated languages than others. They are just different. Therefore, languages should be assessed or should be understood in their own context rather than compared or evaluated using other languages' standards. And I hope at least some of you remember what French Boas did in his fieldwork. I was talking about French Boas when I explained cultural particularism. And the beginning of his awareness of cultural diversity and cultural particularism was when he started to learn the languages of the native tribal societies in North America. He was quite surprised to see the diversity of languages among the native populations. He was also quite shocked by the fact that their languages were really different from the languages that he was more familiar with, such as English, French, and other related languages. So he argued that cultures are particular and no culture is better than others. We need to know and understand each culture in their own context. That's how cultural particularism was born. So linguistic relativity is that perspective on linguistic diversity. Languages also change over time. I'm sure that you have personal experience of observing language change. In my lifetime, which is a lot longer than yours, I saw new technology is born and new terms, new names, new expressions are coined, and they are included in dictionaries. Until very recently, cloud meant something in the sky, something about moisture that moves, you know, it's about weather condition. But nowadays, cloud is also very frequently used as somewhere you store your work data. You know, it's very recent new use of the term cloud. I'm sure that there are numerous such examples. So our current language includes terms like cloud with different meanings. Languages change over time. And the way you shorten certain terms because when you text messages, and that sometimes becomes your colloquial expression as well. So languages do change over time. Then if change is the nature of language, can we do anything for the change to be in a better, more positive direction? Or should we just let it go because change is the nature of language? Well, people differ in their opinion on this, but many linguists and sociolinguists believe that there are better direction for languages change. Language, of course, reflects what is happening in the society, but there is a room for people to make efforts to make language more beautiful. Language contributes to solidarity and harmony in the society rather than problems, problem creating device. So there are positive directions for change. Of course, we cannot achieve it all the time, but the fact that change is inevitable in any language, it does not mean that we cannot do anything about it. So yes, like anything about culture, language is also changing over time. And languages can be born in special circumstances, like contact languages. When there is a contact between groups of people, individuals and groups, then new languages may be born because they need to communicate. They speak different languages, but they need to communicate. Then languages like pidgins are born. And pidgins are created by social conditions. A typical example where this expression pidgin came from is when English speakers went over to islands in the Pacifics, for example. They, as merchants or as missionaries or colonial officers, they had to communicate with the local people. So simplified forms of English with very simple grammar and shortened words were born, and that's called Pidgin English. When pidgins become native languages, meaning that pidgins are transmitted over generations, when it becomes native language, then it's called Creoles. So pidgins and Creoles are similar, but Creoles have taken root in the society as native language. When we look at language and politics and language and society, we also notice linguistic imperialism. Like anything about imperialism, linguistic imperialism has the aspect of power. So power is relevant in this context. So the more powerful people's language becomes dominant, it carries power in itself and it is considered more important, and it could be a means of sort of a lucrative work. Like in colonialism, the colonizers' language may become really important in their colonies, especially for people who seek opportunities in education and career. And globally, it happens. So that's linguistic imperialism. If you expand the meaning, we can think of the importance of English language in today's world. I think we cannot discuss globalization without considering the importance of English language as the language of internet and as the language of commerce, as language of global banking. In a way, it's a linguistic imperialism. We have put a lot of power and value on the language, which became the global language. Later on, we'll discuss the issue of global English further. And language is also closely associated with cultural and ethnic identity. And what kind of language and the efforts to sustain one's own native language is closely related with nationalism and ethnic identity and so forth. And most of us consciously make decisions when we use language. And if we command more than one dialect or more than one language or different mode of speech, we consciously make a decision on which mode to employ in a given context. A politician, for example, from a southern part of Korean Peninsula may speak almost standard, what is considered to be standard Korean language, which is middle class Seoul, speech style. He or she may adopt such speech mode when this assemblyman or politician speaks at the National Assembly. But when this politician is in his hometown talking to the people in the hometown, which happens to be the electorate area, then he or she would switch language into the dialect, which highlights the solidarity of the people of the region, and which also highlights the connection between the politician and the local society. So that's code switching between standard Korean and the dialect. Many people do. And I have code switching or language switching. When I talk to my own children, I talk as a mother, and that's different way of speech. When I give lectures, when I talk in public, my speech style is different. I consciously make decision of which speech mode I will use in a given context. That is what it means by linguistic agency. We are not just passive beings. We are born into language environment and then we just learn the language and we use without thinking. That is not true. We have linguistic agency, being able to decide how to speak, what kind of speech style I'll use in a given context. Most of us are adept at making decisions on this. So that is called code switching or language switching. I talked about global English as a global language. I think very few people would object to this observation. I think it's true, you know. However, increasing number of linguists and cultural specialists argue that now that English has become a global language, should we still believe that what is spoken on BBC of UK or at one of the large research universities in the United States, are they the only standard English, the correct English, and what is spoken in India, what is spoken in Hong Kong, or what is spoken in Australia, they are equally legitimate English. That's what people who advocate the idea of world Englishes believes and argues. Notice that the word English is pluralized. Usually you don't do that with the name of language, right? But here the emphasis is on the idea that there are multiple standards, multiple centers for English language. It's not just for the British people, or it's not just for the Americans, or even Australians, New Zealanders, you know. It's for the world. And people use different way of speaking English, and they are all legitimate. That's what word English is mean. One of such academics, Bott, said very eloquently, and I took this from your textbook. He said, non-native English speakers, like Koreans, Singaporeans, you know, thus created a new culture-sensitive and socially appropriate meanings, expressions of the bilinguals' creativity. You know, in Singapore, for example, English is one of the official languages, and I think most Singaporeans speak English beautifully, especially the educated Singaporeans. However, there are some characteristic expressions, characteristic vocabulary, and pronunciation. You notice. And the Singaporeans, some Singaporeans call it Singlish, right? And there are many other versions of English, Konglish, right? And many others. And we notice the characteristics of these different versions of Englishes. That's expressions of the bilingual's creativity. By altering and manipulating the structure and function of English in its new ecology, in its new environment. So, according to Bott, these are new creative versions of English, so which is not inferior to BBC English, which should not be considered as the incorrect or wrong English. That's what, you know, those who argue the idea of word English is believe. In this context, after I finish up all my lectures, there's this video is the last one, Accents of English Around the World. It's a 6-minute video on how these word Englishes sound. Some well-known people, including some prominent political leaders, speak English with various accents. Political leaders and actors and actresses, soccer players. What are some characteristics of Korean English? I'm sure that there are quite a few. Korean specific pronunciation and Korean specific use of words, right? Actually, the idea of word Englishes has a very deep political implication because it is an argument that contests the idea that some centers like London or Boston, New York, these are not centers for the global language. Okay, there can be many others. Now, so political implication of world English view is pluricentricity. There can be many other centers outside Europe, outside North America. There can be many. And another idea which becomes increasingly important is language right as one of the fundamental human rights. If you're forced to give up your native language and forced to speak, for example, the colonizer's language, then it's a breach of basic human rights. That's the idea here. Language is very important part of one's cultural heritage, right? One's own legacy. And if you have to give up your language, then it means that you have to sacrifice your heritage and forced to adopt something else. So that's the idea behind language right as one of the fundamental human rights. Okay, let's move on to another very important issue in the study of language and culture and society. Quite a few academics studied the issue of language and cognition. By cognition, we mean knowing. Cognition is a somewhat, academic word, but in more colloquial term, it means knowing something, knowing. So cognition of the world is understanding and knowing the world or about the world. These academics have been interested in what language does in our understanding of the world and society. Two prominent names here. One is Edward Sapir, a linguist, a sociolinguist. He said that language is a guide to social reality. So what language we speak really affects us and it guides us through the social reality. It affects our understanding of the social reality. This has been accepted by many people. Benjamin Lee Wolfe went a step further. He said that conception of the world is determined by the language. Notice the very strong word determined. So how we conceive the world is determined by the language. And this still remains as a hypothesis because, like I said, determine is a very strong expression. And many people, including myself, question this strong statement because sometimes we have a moment when we understand something, we perceive something, cannot find the words to describe or express, but it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? We understand, we perceive, conceive, but we cannot find words to describe it. So in this case, our conception of the world is not determined by the language. It is highly affected, but it's not determined. So Benjamin Lee Wolfe's statement is it still remains as a hypothesis. Because language is really important in our understanding, our perception of the world, there is a field in the study of language and culture and society called ethnosemantics. It's a study of how societies or cultures classify things differently. And by studying the classifications made in the society, we can understand cultural logic in the society. So each language employs its own cultural logic in making classifications. Let me take an example to make it easier to understand. Okay, how do you classify animals? If you're an anthropologist or linguist, if you ask a group of people, or a group of tribal society, uh, you ask the people, so what's the most important way to classify animals? In some societies, people may answer, oh, there are edible animals and inedible animals. Animals you can eat, animals you cannot eat. That's the most important distinction. That's the classification made in society A. In society B, you may have a totally different answer. Uh, in in that society, people may answer, "Oh, there are animals in the sky who flies, like birds and insects, some insects, uh, and animals on the ground, and animals in the water." That may be the most important classification. So there are many different ways, and you understand the cultural logic behind it. That's ethnosemantics. That's a study of language, society, and culture, focusing on different aspects of the topic. People who try to understand how language is used, how language is spoken in the society, and using language as a tool to understand the culture and society are called sociolinguists or linguistic anthropologists, linguistic sociologists. They may differ slightly, but they're basically studying the use of language in the society. One of the best known sociolinguists is Saussure, and he talked about the difference between langue and parole. Langue is language, parole is speech, use of language in the society, the actual use of the language. And sociolinguists are mainly concerned about parole, speech. Those linguists study topics like gender and language use. And depending on your gender, language use differ greatly. Um, in some languages, the difference is very large. Gender gap is very large. In some societies, it's not. When you learn a foreign language, in some languages, for example, Japanese language, it is very important to learn how to speak according to your gender. So if you're a woman, you have to learn woman's Japanese. If you're a man, of course, you have to learn how to speak like a male in Japanese society. The difference is very large, actually. Um, I learned a Japanese language when I was in the United States, not in Korea. And I took courses, and it was 5 hours a week. So from Monday to Friday, 1 hour every day. And 3 hours were taught by professors, and 2 hours were taught by drill instructors who were native speakers and who helped us practice the language. And the university had difficulty because difficulty in recruiting the right drill instructors because most people who applied for the job were young women who are from Japan, who are spending some time in the area in the United States. And as a Korean speaker, for which gender gap is not as large as that is in Japanese, I didn't understand that. But really, that was an issue. I asked, why don't the women Japanese instructors teach male speech, pretending that they were men? They told me that that's unthinkable. That's not possible. What they ended up doing was to invite uh, business businessmen from some companies in the area who are from Japan. They specially invited this Japanese man to teach male student on the male speech. So in this case, the gender aspect of parol and for Japanese language is very important in that case. In some languages, that is an issue, a bigger issue than others. So sociolinguists study male and female speech. In some cultures, male speech is more assertive, tend to be shorter, different characteristics depending on the gender. Language and power are also associated in many societies. People of different classes use different way of speech, and if you observe the speech style, then you are able to understand the hierarchy or power relations in the society. You also study dialects, and we call it horizontal differences. It's sort of a regional differences compared to there is a typo, vertical, vertical differences, meaning hierarchy in the society based on class. The notion of AAVE, which is the last item on today's slides, AAVE, as explained in your textbook, it means African American Vernacular English. Many people might have noticed that, different ethnic groups, different races, through history and culture, they have different accents and different way of speaking and even different grammar. For a long time in American society, they believed and they said that, African American vernacular English is a substandard, incorrect, wrong English. And the middle class, white middle class or urban speech style is the correct one. It was the standard. However, there are people, actually increasing number of people who argue that that should be understood as it is, rather than compared to other, English as a standard. So those who argue that say AAVE is a system with an invariant core, like in any language, that should be analyzed without reference to other dialects, like white middle class English. That's the idea. But like any other issues for immigrants or ethnic groups, race, this is a serious issue. As parents, for example, you may find that, speaking AAVE might be disadvantageous in education and career, reflecting the reality, in the society. Then, while believing AAVE is a system that should be analyzed without reference to other dialects, you may still want to teach your children what is considered to be standard English, which will be on the test, the standard test, which will be helpful in their academics and career. So language, again, language is not just language. Language carries many important meanings, including political implications and even economic implications. So, up until now, we have been looking at the notion of language and culture, language in the society from many different angles. And going back to the topic of linguistic diversity, how we view English as the language of globalization. We are talking about the power difference between societies and between countries. And because in today's world, some English-speaking countries are commanding political and economic power, their language has this power and has this impact over many global processes. But there is also this discussion of world Englishes. And this is an example. Actually, this is something, I think this video was made something to make it interesting. It's not a serious video, but I think it's a really good example of the notion of word Englishes. So let me copy this information onto our chatting window. And this is 6-minute video. And after you have your second break, please come back by maybe 5:20 for those of you who want to participate in the last hour discussion session, which is optional.